Good morning. Today, over the next 45 minutes, I will be talking about this new disease that we know for the last 3 months, primarily concentrating on the management of COVID-19 and some important clinically relevant facts about the virus, its etiopathogenesis, and a little bit of the history part as well. This will be for the next 45 minutes or so. The talk will be covering how it all began from the historical perspective. It's important to know how this pandemic started, where it started, and because this will have a bearing on how we are going to manage and perhaps on some future implications on its treatment and management, vaccination, prevention of the disease, etc. What is it all about? Epidemiology, what is COVID-19 exactly, a brief touch on about its virology, clinical features, management in general, with some relevance to ICU as well, prevention and infection control measures, and to end it all, what are the discharge criteria, and if a patient unfortunately doesn't survive or succumbs to the disease, how do we take care of the dead body of the patient. So in general, it will be an overall clinical summary of COVID-19 in general. So how it all began. As you know, coronaviruses were first described in 1960. Till about this millennium, till 2000 plus onwards, we always assumed that coronavirus was a relatively benign virus, not causing too many infections in humans. There were documented infections in other vertebrates, but not so many in humans. And any human infection documented always used to present as a very mild common cold. So it was considered as a non-fatal viral disease till about 2002. 2002 was the first time, or 2003 to be more precise, was the first time that the SARS epidemic, which was called as the severe acute respiratory syndrome epidemic, which was caused by a specific type of coronavirus, which is now christened as SARS-CoV, which was responsible for a catastrophic epidemic which ran across many countries, causing high mortality. So this was the first time it was documented historically that a coronavirus infection causes death. The subsequent infection was another epidemic called the MERS coronavirus, which is the Middle East Eastern Respiratory Syndrome virus, which had another epidemic in 2012, which was caused by another type of coronavirus. Now, following these two coronavirus infections, COVID-19, which is now officially called as SARS-CoV-2, which started in the later months of, or the last month of 2019, is the third epidemic of corona that we have seen in this century. The first reported cases of COVID-19 infection or coronavirus viral disease caused by the SARS-CoV-2 was first detected in the Wuhan city of Hubei province in China, where a cluster of cases of upper respiratory infections leading on to some of them progressing on to pneumonia was first reported in the second half of December, and a clustering of these cases happened around the 31st of December 2019. Now, eventually over the next few days, multiple such cases occurred and were admitted into two medical hospitals in the city of Wuhan, which is one of the province, which is the capital of the Hubei province in the eastern part of China. The beginnings of this viral infection or this pandemic was localized to the possibility of the infection perhaps starting in the wet seafood markets of Wuhan, but there is not enough documentation yet to prove that. But there was clustering with this, about 60% of the first cluster of patients having had a contact either directly or indirectly with the seafood market in Wuhan. Subsequently, the virus was first isolated on the 7th of January by a research team in China, and it was declared as a public health emergency of international concern on the 30th of January, which means in that 1 month between the 31st of December when the first clustering of these cases was reported and the 30th of January, the number of cases continued to increase substantially to the point that it crossed the border of China, and the first few cases started to be reported in the surrounding, in the countries adjoining China like Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, etc. during this period of time. Uh, uh, it was on the 1st of January 2020 that Wuhan admitted that, or the health authorities of Wuhan admitted that this was an epidemic which is arising from the seafood market, and they shut down the market as well. The first case was reported outside China on the 13th of January, and as I mentioned to you, 30th of January was when it was declared as a public health emergency by the WHO. The first case in India was reported on the 30th of January, and eventually by 11th of March it was declared as a pandemic by the World Health Organization. Now, if you look at this slide, it shows the sequential increase in the number of cases which started in China, density of the cases or the prevalence of the cases increasing in China, largely localized to the eastern part of China, and subsequently as the days progressed, later half of January, early part of February, it continued to progress and across the world. The different colors, as you can see in the slide, shows the density of the number of cases, and you see that a number of these countries started from a very low density and progressively increased to about 1,000 plus cases per country by the end of February. Now, what is a coronavirus? It is a single-stranded RNA enveloped virus which is spherical in shape and has a number of club-shaped glycoproteins, which gives its name called the corona, which is something like which coats, these glycoproteins coat the viral body or the viral RNA or the viral envelope like a crown, and hence the name corona. There are 4 subtypes: alpha, beta, gamma and delta. And the most recent epidemic, which is the COVID-19 epidemic, is very similar in its genomic genome to the SARS-CoV, which is the first coronavirus epidemic, which occurred in 2003, again originating from China and localizing to the Southeast Asian countries. So, as I already told you, there were 2 recent epidemics in this century. Before the COVID-19 disease epidemic. The first one was the SARS-CoV-1, which was in 2003, and the second one was in 2012, which is the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome or the MERS-CoV. COVID-19, as we call the new disease or the new pandemic, is about 79% similar in its genomic configuration to the SARS-CoV-1, and does have a close similarity to another coronavirus which causes infections in bats. Now, how does the coronavirus enter the human body? The most common route of spread or of human to human transmission is by airborne or droplet spread. I will talk in detail about the transmission in the next few slides. So if you look at this slide, you see that the coronavirus or any virus needs a receptor to enter the cell or to become intracellular. So the coronavirus, like the SARS-CoV, which was the 2003 SARS epidemic, uses the ACE2 receptors present on the respiratory epithelium to bind itself and to become internalized into the intracellular, and once it is intracellular, they replicate rapidly, cause cell destruction, and also result in intense inflammatory reaction by activating the T helper cells, suppressing the T suppressor cells, and further activating the natural killer cells. So essentially, both the SARS-CoV-1 and the SARS-CoV-2, which causes the COVID-19 infection, is nothing but a catastrophic inflammatory cytokine reaction which is triggered following replication of the viruses in the human cell, and these cytokine inflammatory reaction that results following the infection causes the multi-system organ failure, including the very severe ARDS that is known to be well associated with this virus and the other coronaviruses as well. So essentially, it's a massive inflammatory cascade that happens following internalization of the cell following internalization of the virus by the ACE2 receptors into the respiratory epithelial cells, and results in the multi-system organ failure. Now moving on to the transmission dynamics, the case fatality ratio, as we would say in SARS-CoV and MERS, was much higher than the current virus, which is the COVID-2 or the SARS-CoV-2. SARS-CoV had a case fatality ratio of about 40% as compared to MERS, which has a case fatality of about 10%. In comparison, the case fatality ratio for SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19 disease is much lower to the tune of about 2 to 5%, and some studies say to about 7%. It also of course depends on the population that we are talking about, and as we know from in the last 3 months from the epidemiological data arising out of the SARS-CoV-2 infections or the COVID-19 infections, the mortality and the morbidity seems to be much higher in patients who are having severe comorbidities, elderly age group, and the immunosuppressed patients as well. But in general, the mortality is around 2 to 5% if you look at all infected patients. But the ICU mortality in these patients turns out to be much higher, to the tune of about 25 to 40%. Now, infectivity of any disease or any infection is measured by a specific parameter called R naught. What is R naught? It is nothing but the number of cases which are directly produced by one person in a population susceptible to have the infection, which means if you leave an infected person in a susceptible population, how many infections or how many persons would get infected by this one infected individual is what is described as R naught. The initial studies from Wuhan and the initial preliminary data which came out of the Hubei province and the first cluster of cases showed that the R naught for this was around 2.2, with the confidence interval ranging from 1.4 to 3.9, which means that for every one infected individual, there would be about 2 to 3.5 new infected patients when this infected individual is left in a susceptible population, or the average people infected is about 2.5 to 3.5. In comparison to the other viruses like the H1N1, where the R naught is 1.9, and for the for the SARS-CoV, which was the first coronavirus infection of this century, in 2003, where the R naught was a little lower to the tune of about 2.1. Now, very recent data, as late as last week or the last few days, there is some emerging data to say that the R naught in the United States and Europe seems to be much higher, to the tune of about 4 to 6 as well. But of course, this is very early data. We need more literature to back it up. But for now, the available literature suggests that the R naught, or the infectivity of a given individual to spread infection in a susceptible population, is anywhere between about 2 to 3.5 new infections for a given infected person. Now, this slide shows how you could actually reduce the risk of infection by decreasing movement of people or communication of people or social interaction of people between each other, and that is what is the basic fundamental principle that we today talk about as social isolation. So the less people interact with each other, the less is the risk of catching an infection, and by that way we can actually break the transmission cycle. So if you look at this, the red colored parts or the pink parts are the parts where the person is exposed and starts getting infected, while the grey parts are those individuals who are not infected. And if you actually reduce the transmission, if you actually reduce the number of people coming in contact with the infected people, you see that drastically the infection and transmission gets reduced. And as we have known, most administrations across the world, most authorities across the world recommend what we call as complete lockdown and social isolation. The reason being that the lesser the people come in contact with each other, there is lesser infectivity, and therefore the transmission of this virus between individuals is reduced, thus hopefully getting the pandemic into control. Now, what are the modes of transmission for coronaviruses? As we know, the infection causing the coronaviruses are primarily seen in other vertebrates like bats, sheep, pangolins, other reptiles, birds, etc. So transmission of coronaviral infections from a from this animal population to high humans is not common, but it can happen, and that is how the previous to virus infection outbreaks occur. And once it enters the humans, or once it infects a human, human to human transmission commonly occurs by airborne droplet infections. Now, when you talk about airborne infections, there are two types of infections which can happen. One is direct, what we call as droplet infection, where another human individual comes within a meter radius of the infected individual, and you find that when there is a cough or a sneeze, these droplets directly get deposited on the mucosa or conjunctiva of the eyes of the susceptible individual and can cause infections. But many of these airborne infections can also be transmitted by what is called as droplet nuclei. Now, these droplet nuclei have the potential to stay in the atmosphere or in the surrounding surfaces of the patient for a variable period lengths of times, which means that when a cough is generated or a sneeze is generated, the wet droplet nuclei get dried up and they get deposited in the fomites or in the surfaces around the infected patient, and when a susceptible individual comes in contact with these surfaces, then there is fomite transfer which can also happen. And as we today know, the transmissibility or the transmission of coronavirus 2 or COVID-19 infection between two humans is by airborne droplet spread as well as by droplet nuclei, and because of the droplet nuclei, fomite spread is also known, and that's one of the reasons why this particular infection seems to be very infective, or seems to have a much higher R0 or transmission of infection to more number of people as compared to some of the previously known droplet airborne infections that we know of, like the H1N1 or the SARS-CoV-1. As I already mentioned, modes of transmission for COVID-19, like any other, like the previous corona infection, is by droplet and airborne infections. I've already explained that. Fomite transfer, because of the deposition of these droplet nuclei on the surfaces around the patient, which then makes it a good source for fomite transfer when another susceptible individual touches it and doesn't have appropriate hand hygiene. You find that the infection can spread to the susceptible population. Fecal-oral transmission has been suspected in COVID infections but not documented. Now, this is based on the fact that the recent data which came out in January and early part of February, studies have shown, or anecdotal reports have shown, that many of these patients who are infected with COVID-19 or who have had COVID-19 continue to excrete the virus in their fecal matter for a very prolonged period of time. However, as of today, we don't have any scientific evidence to show that fecal-oral spread is possible, and there is no documented case of orofecal contamination or fecal spread of the disease. So also in the existing data that we have until today, there is no evidence of vertical transmission. So to summarize, the predominant modes of transmission of SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19 disease is by droplet and airborne spread, and by airborne infection and by fomite transfer. Now, this figure or this animated diagram shows you that following an infection which is from the upper respiratory passage, the infection enters into the respiratory epithelium and causes the significant viral disease that we today know, or pneumonia, which is then ends up as a very bad viral ARDS, and subsequently the patient who has this viral infection brings out the droplet infections either through a cough or a sneeze, or through other aerosolized procedures, either from the upper respiratory tract or from the lower respiratory tract, as you can see from this infection. Now, cough is a very important mode of transmission of or spreading the virus, aerosolized droplet particles into the environment. Now, this two diagrams which was published in the NEJM shows how once a cough occurs, how in terms of how it spreads in the atmosphere, and also the velocity at which cough is actually propels these viral particles into the atmosphere. So if there is a patient or if there is a susceptible individual within 3 feet or 1 meter distance, you find that there is direct deposition of these droplet infection particles onto the patient's face or onto the susceptible individual's face, or if he draws in this air, you find that the infected particles enter into the respiratory epithelium, causing infection in the new individual. So also sneeze is a very effective, important method of transmission of the virus into the atmosphere, and is a projectile way in which you find that the velocity at which the virus gets expelled into the atmosphere causes risk of infection in the new individual who is very close to the person who is infected, or it can also result in ejection of the droplet nuclei to variable lengths distances away from the infected patient. So today we know that the risk of having droplet spread or the fomites getting deposited on the surfaces can be as long as to the distance of about 2 meters, and hence unlike the initial studies where we said 1 meter distance is the area around the patient where the risk of infection is high, today this has been increased to 2 meters, and therefore all contact precautions need to be taken whenever we are attending to patients who are known to be having COVID infection or who are suspected to be having COVID infection. Not only are we in contact, but we are coming in 2 meter within the 2 meter radius of patients who are having or suspected to be having an infection. Now this video shows you how a cough or a sneeze can generate the droplet and how it actually spreads into the atmosphere. So as you can see, from at the point at which the jet is produced at the mouth or at the nose, as it spreads out into the atmosphere, the jet covers a much wider area because of the projectile nature and the spray of the jet which happens as well. So this video shows how the infection spreads very rapidly or can actually has a potential to spread infection into the surrounding patients, and that is the reason social isolation plays a significant role in decreasing the spread of infection, and therefore has a role in controlling the epidemic. This slide shows a very nicely done study on the deposition of the viral particles and how long they stay viable on different surfaces. So as you can see, the aerosol remains in the environment for about 3 hours. On copper, the active virus remains active for about 8 hours. On cardboard for 24 hours, 72 hours on 24 hours on stainless steel, and on plastic up to about 48 to 72 hours. Now, this was a well-conducted study where they actually looked at active viral replication or active viruses on different surfaces after having deposited the virus on various surfaces. Now, this again shows that the fomite transmission continues to stay active whenever, even if the patient is not in the vicinity of the area, and hence it is very important to ensure proper hand hygiene and terminal cleaning of all those areas wherever the patients have needed to be quarantined, or where the patients have actually, whichever area the patients have actually used. In comparison to SARS-CoV-1, the SARS-CoV-2 infection, SARS-CoV-2, the rate of the fomites having active viruses seems to be a little longer, especially on steel and plastic surfaces, as compared to SARS-CoV-1. So this is a very important fact to remember, that because of the very long stay of the active virus on these surfaces, it is important to make the fomite spread of viruses is a very important method of transmission, unlike the other lesser transmissible diseases like H1N1. So as we know from data from H1N1, influenza viruses are not so strong enough or so not so strong enough to actually stay on surfaces, unlike the coronaviruses, which actually can remain for much longer hours on room temperature on these on variety of surfaces, and therefore have a much higher transmissible rate and are not, as we have already seen. Now, early transmission dynamics from China, from the initial studies from Wuhan, show, if you look at this graph, it shows that the darker spots or the darker bars here show the link to the seafood market. But as we go to much later in the chronological order, especially as we touch to the middle of January, we find that the orange bars, which were the thick orange bars, do not exist anymore. So which means that the initial transmission, which was related to the seafood market, eventually fades away, and you find that it is more of human to human transmission. So it was well documented only by late January or mid-January that human to human transmission was possible, and the rest of the epidemic has actually spread by human to human transmission and with no contact to the original source of the Hunan seafood wholesale market, which hence the closure of the market itself didn't help too much in actually controlling the epidemic. So this circle part of the chronology of where the virus spread in the Hubei province shows that it was all from human to human transmission after the second half of January, with most of these patients who came during this time or who developed the disease during this time having no contact or no primary source contact to the seafood market itself. The initial epidemiological data showed that the average age of these patients who were getting infected was in the range of about 56 to 60 years, and as the transmission increased, or the later clusters of the disease showed that much older people got infected. So it was the first cluster which was a little younger, but the subsequent cluster showed an elderly population with the median age group between about 60 to 61, unlike the first cluster which had a median age group of about 56. So there was a male preponderance, as we see, and the market exposure, or the exposure to the wet market, which was about 64% in the first 1 or 2 clusters, dropped to about 6% in the subsequent clusters, showing that it was predominantly human to human transmission, which was the primary route of transmission of the disease, with no connection to the animal market in the later clusters itself. This graph again shows the characteristics of the disease. Again, this is all very early data which we got from the Chinese study. You find that the days of development of symptoms peaks by about 4th or 5th day from the time the infection occurs, which means if the patient gets infected on day 0, the peak of the infection is around 3 to 5 days, or the peak of symptoms is at about 3 to 5 days, and it wanes off by about 3 weeks. So which means that the first 48 to 72 hours the patients will still have the infection but may have no symptoms, as in any other form of upper respiratory infections, where we know that many a time the infection or the patients are infected even before the symptoms occur. So also the days from the onset of illness to the first medical visit is averages around 24 to 48 hours from the time the patient actually develops the first symptoms. So this also shows that by the time the patient seeks medical attention, he has already probably infected a few of his close contacts before they actually come into contact with the medical facility. The fourth graph, or the graph B, shows the relative frequency of the infection and the days from the onset to hospitalization. Right. The first cluster showed that majority of the patients, about 88% of patients had fever, about 68% of them had dry cough, and fever and fatigue and such other vague symptoms were of much lower incidence. So which means that fever and dry cough contributed to about 60 to 80% of the initial symptoms in which the patients presented. ARDS were seen in earlier about 3%. Chest X-ray findings were seen in about 60%, and radiologically and CT scan findings were seen in about 86% of patients. So which means that if you put fever, dry cough, maybe chest X-ray, and very importantly a positive CT scan finding, you would actually pick up 85% of patients with a combination of clinical features and radiological investigations. Of course, this is data from from the first few clusters, the first 500 to 800 patients. So therefore, whether this trend will continue in the rest of the epidemic, we would need more data we would need more time to analyze it and to know more about the further epidemiological patterns. Non-published data from Italy, US, Spain, France, and such other European countries which are now battling with the corona disease seem to follow the very similar cluster. The only thing seems to be a little different in the Italian population is that the average age in the Italian population seems to be much higher, which is of course the normal pattern of the population census of northern Italy. So largely what we today sort of know by unpublished data is that the Chinese demographic which we got from the first few clusters seems to be replicated in the other parts of the world as well. Now, there could be a number of types of clinical presentations. 80% of patients present with an uncomplicated illness or a very mild pneumonia. When we talk about uncomplicated illness, it is like any other upper respiratory tract infection with a bit of fever, cough, sore throat, some vague nasal stuffiness, headache, malaise, etc. Elderly and immunocompromised patients, like any other illness, may not show the typical symptoms. So it's very important to keep an open eye and a low threshold of suspicion in these kind of elderly or immunosuppressed patients if they do develop some form of respiratory illness, to consider COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 infection as a possibility. Mild pneumonias are seen in a good number of patients who may need hospitalization in the ward. Here there will be some signs of pneumonia on examination, may or may not need oxygen, but they are largely stable with predominantly upper respiratory symptoms. Severe pneumonia seen in about 15 to 20% of patients. Now these are the patients who would end up needing high dependency unit admission or admission into ICU. The mortality in these patients remain extremely high, to the tune of about 20 to 40%. And especially so when they develop very severe ARDS. So severe pneumonia is diagnosed when they have a very high-grade fever, very severe infection, and one of the following, namely respiratory rate more than 30, saturation below 90% on room air, and many of these patients may end up needing different forms of respiratory support like non-invasive ventilators, HFNO, or mechanical ventilation. The other presentations known are ARDS. Patients can present with the features of sepsis or septic shock as defined by the and the diagnosis of this is based by the definitions given by the Sepsis Society guidelines. Now, for matters of screening, diagnosis and testing, the Government of India has put out its own guidelines. The case definitions, there are different case definitions. So as we know today, we define what is called a SARI or severe acute respiratory illness as one of the important necessities for a patient to be screened or to be suspected to be having COVID-19. So any patient who has an acute respiratory illness with a history of fever measured by a temperature of more than 38 degrees centigrade and cough, which has its onset in the last 10 to 14 days, requiring hospitalization, is defined as SARI or severe acute respiratory illness. Now, any of these patients who come to us to the hospital, this definition which I have already told, or which is seen here, will need to be suspected to be having COVID-19 disease and will need to be screened accordingly. Now this definition has evolved over the last 2 to 3 weeks. Initial definitions said any patient with SARI and a significant history of travel to certain specific countries. Then we modified the definition to say SARI with history of travel outside. But today we say any patient who presents with SARI needs to be screened for needs to be screened for COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 infection. Now, when do we suspect SARS-CoV-2 infection? So one is, as I said, presence of SARI in who have symptoms. So all symptomatic individuals who have undertaken international travel in the last 14 days, all symptomatic contacts of laboratory confirmed cases, all symptomatic healthcare workers, all patients with SARI and asymptomatic direct and high risk contacts of a confirmed case should also be tested once between day 5 and day 14 after they have come in contact with the confirmed case. So these are the 5 patients or the 5 categories of patients who need to be screened with the relevant tests when we think about with relevant tests to rule out SARS-CoV-2 infections. As recent as 2 days ago, the Ministry of Health and Family Affairs has further modified the testing criteria and has included another criteria wherein hotspots have been identified, wherein there is clustering of cases. So in the presence of clustering of cases or large migration gatherings of people or evacuees, or if this clustering happens in centers where you have quarantined or have kept certain evacuees from other nations or patients with international travel, there is yet another criteria which is added. Any patient who has symptomatic influenza-like illness, which is presence of fever, cough, sore throat or running nose, or for that matter what I already mentioned as SARI, will need to have a RT-PCR test done within 7 days of the illness, or after 7 days of the illness, if they have to have an antibody test done, and which if negative and confirmed by a negative RT-PCR, then we could call them as disease free. So to summarize, just to briefly tell you who are the patients you need to suspect, is anybody who are symptomatic, which I told as SARI, which is the presence of fever, cough, sore throat, running nose, symptomatic individuals with international travel, or who have come in contact with lab positive cases, or symptomatic healthcare workers, or patients or all those high risk contacts or healthcare workers who have come in contact with a positive patient between day 5 and 14 will need to be screened. In hotspots or clusters, the new addition is to do the RT-PCR screen in symptomatic individuals, or to consider an antibody test if they are positive or to consider antibody test if they have an illness which comes after 7 days of coming in contact in hotspots, as you call it. Now, a symptomatic patient refers to any patient who is having fever, cough or shortness of breath. What is the definition of a direct or high risk contact? All those patients, all those contacts who are living in the same household or with a confirmed case and are in a direct or high risk contact are those contacts who are living in the same household with a confirmed case, or a healthcare worker who has examined a confirmed case. So these individuals constitute as direct and high risk contacts and would be needed to be screened as per category 5, which I have already discussed. Now this is a flowchart which has been put out by the ICMR and the Ministry of Health on the pathway to be considered in the cluster or containment zone, or in those patients who are symptomatic when they are in amidst of a large gathering of evacuees, or in amidst of a presence of a large collection or gathering of people. Now, sample collection is done for all those patients for whom an RT-PCR needs to be done. A nasopharyngeal or a throat swab is done. A nasopharyngeal swab is preferred. This is because the yield with an nasopharyngeal swab, when done properly, can vary between 80 to 95% sensitivity as compared to a throat swab where the sensitivity can drop to between 30 to 50%. So a nasopharyngeal swab is preferred, and the people or the healthcare workers who are drawing up the or who are taking the nasopharyngeal swab needs to be thoroughly trained in one, ensuring that they don't get themselves infected by wearing appropriate personal protective equipment, and also collecting the swab in an appropriate way so that the yield of the swab is good. Once the swab is collected, it is put into what is called as a viral transport media and then transferred to a regional lab. At this point of time, every district headquarters or city has one or two regional labs, either under either designated government lab, or it could be a designated private lab to which the samples need to be sent, and the results after a turnover time of around 24 hours or 48 hours are received back to the screening center or the test or the medical facility from where the sample has been drawn. So it is very important to have certain basic guidelines in place when we do a sample collection, and it is ideal to have training for individuals who are going to draw these samples. All these individuals who are drawing the samples or the nasopharyngeal swab need to be having appropriate personal protective equipment, and the details of which I will discuss later. They also need to ensure that this is done in a isolation room, preferably which has a negative pressure ventilation, so that the risk of spreading of infection to the other adjoining people around that area is minimized. This chart is taken from the ICMR guidelines. It is available on the Government of India website or the ICMR website. This in detail it gives how the swab needs to be collected, how it needs to be put into the viral transport media, and then subsequently with all proper PP precautions need to be transferred or to be sent to the transported to the regional lab. Now, just to recapitulate the clinical presentations, as I said, the SARS-CoV-2 could present as an uncomplicated infection, mild pneumonia, severe pneumonia, or any of its complications such as ARDS, sepsis, or septic shock. This presentation or the severity of its presentation has a bearing on the treatment as well. So moving on to the next section, I will discuss briefly some of the existing treatment modalities. I should admit that at this point of time, most available treatment modalities are supportive in nature. The specific treatment modalities are largely based on very poor literature, or what we call as physiological rationale, hypothetical situation, physiological rationale with very little data available from randomized trials at this point of time. There are ongoing randomized trials, the results of which will be probably available in the next 2 to 3 months. The mild pneumonia patients needn't do not require any form of specific therapy. Most importantly here, they would need supportive care, contact and droplet infection precautions, both from the point of view of the patient himself as well as from his contacts. So the patient who presents with the mild illnesses needs to wear a mask so that he minimizes droplet spread of the infection. Occasionally these patients may need oxygen, but it's important that they are given good supportive care and are most importantly quarantined in a ward or a quarantine facility or at home. The current recommendations from the local health authorities is to ensure that these patients are quarantined in a healthcare facility to ensure strict compliance with quarantining. Severe pneumonia would require supportive management, as I already said, because it is a viral infection. Very little specific treatment is available. Oxygen or any other form of advanced positive pressure devices such as non-invasive ventilation, high flow oxygen, or eventually mechanical ventilation if the patient deteriorates to the level or the lung worsens to the level of requiring high levels of support. Antipyretics, empirical antibiotic therapy would be started in all these patients because they are very sick, and the protocol for the empirical antibiotic therapy would be based on the hospitals or the regional antibiotic guidelines. Usually in our part of the world, the empirical therapy is to use ceftriaxone with an atypical cover with azithromycin or levofloxacin with oseltamivir. That used to be the conventional cocktail of drugs that we used to start for patients with community acquired pneumonia. So that needs to be started in patients with severe pneumonia, even though you're suspecting SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19 disease, because we don't want to be missing out on a treatable problem prior to the onset of the results of the COVID-2 test. One change which may be recommended is to use doxycycline here in place of azithromycin, because of the risk of azithromycin in combination with chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine, which is known to cause QTc prolongation. And as we know today, the empirical therapy for treating this disease is a combination of hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin. So it may be appropriate to start atypical cover with doxycycline in these patients till the COVID report arises, and then further titrating the therapy to a COVID specific treatment or to a community acquired non-COVID infection therapy. Coming to role of non-invasive ventilation and high flow nasal oxygen. We know that hypoxemic respiratory failure, HFNO as we would abbreviate high flow nasal cannula or nasal oxygen as, HFNO is a very important or a useful modality of therapy for what we call as hypoxemic respiratory failure. But in the context of SARS-CoV-2 disease or COVID-19 infection, the utility of HFNC is very poorly documented. One, because of still inadequate experience. Whatever experience that we have from the SARS-CoV-1 data shows that the use of high flow nasal cannula was probably associated with a higher risk of mortality, both with NIV as well as HFNC. The reason for this is unclear, but it is probably because of the false sense of security that happens when these patients are on non-invasive modalities of ventilation and the delay in intubating these patients. But most importantly, what we know from SARS-CoV-1 data is that the use of NIV and HFNC produces a lot of aerosolization and can actually cause an increased risk of infection to the healthcare worker or the provider of the health or the healthcare provider who is taking care of the patient, of the infected patient. Hence, the decision to use these forms of non-invasive ventilation or HFNC should be based on the balance of the therapeutic benefits versus the aerosolization that it causes, and hence exposing the risk of the disease to the healthcare worker itself. However, more recent data seems to suggest that NIV and HFNC can still be considered on a case-to-case basis. Mechanical ventilation I will talk about in detail when we talk about ARDS, and most severe pneumonias, like in any other severe forms of pneumonia, fluid restriction is a very important form of therapy, because we know that restriction of fluid in the first 72 hours, specifically in patients with severe pneumonia or ARDS, actually reduces the length of ventilation, decreases their hypoxemia, and allows them to be weaned off the ventilator early, though there may be not much of mortality benefit that is proven. Principles of managing ARDS in a patient with SARS-CoV infection is like any other ARDS, or as in managing any other ARDS patients or ARDS with other etiologies. So the basic principles remain, which is the baby lung ventilation and an open lung concept provided by low tidal volume of about 4 to 6 ml per kg, a high rate of about 25 to 35 per minute to try to optimize minute ventilation, at plateau pressure of less than 25, PEEP titrated to optimal oxygenation, balancing the oxygenation with hemodynamics. Generally, moderate PEEP is what we today use in ARDS, and if a much higher PEEP is needed, we would prefer to use prone ventilation or other forms of therapies in these patients. Prone ventilation from early data seems that proning these patients early seems to be beneficial by improving their oxygenation significantly. Uh, Data emerging out of the experience of Italy, specifically from Italy, looks like prone ventilation seems to be, or the patients with ARDS secondary to SARS-CoV disease seem to be much more susceptible, much more receptive to proning, or much more, seem to be responding to proning much earlier than other forms of ARDS, and the use of permissive hypercapnia if the ARDS is very, very severe. Some of the management principles of ventilating these ventilating the ARDS patients with viral pneumonias. Other forms of complications like septic shock, multi-organ failure would be predominantly use of supportive modalities like dialysis when indicated, use of vasopressors when indicated, use of other forms of mechanical cardiovascular support whenever it is indicated. There is data in terms of anecdotal case reports for the use of ECMO both as a modality of respiratory support and as a modality of cardiovascular support, mostly coming from the Japanese experience. However, it is not something which can be recommended as a standard of care and can be used as a rescue therapy in extremely sick cases where everything else has failed. Moving on to specific therapies, as I already mentioned, there is no specific antivirals which are available, which are of proven benefit. We have used a number of types of therapies have been used. In fact, if you look at the Indian guideline itself, till about 10 days ago, the initial recommendation was to use a combination of lopinavir and ritonavir. Because these are two antiretroviral drugs which are used in the management of RVD or retroviral disease. So this was tried in combination and with variable success, but an RCT published in the NEJM a couple of weeks ago showed no benefit even when it was used in patients with severe disease. The more recent guideline put out by the ICMR about a week ago was to use hydroxychloroquine in the dose of 400 mg twice a day for the first day, followed by 200 mg BD for 4 days in combination with azithromycin 500 mg once a day for 5 days. Now this again is based on anecdotal experience, case series, and some data emerging out of the Chinese experience. There is an ongoing trial, 4-armed trial conducted and funded by the WHO at this point of time, wherein the 4 different types of therapies are being tried. That is the combination of lopinavir and ritonavir, use of interferon beta 1A alone or in combination with one of the antivirals. Remdesivir has been used in various diseases. This was by a few centers in treating COVID-19 infection. Now this is based out of the experience of using remdesivir in the treatment of Ebola, and of course the 4th arm which is being considered, which is being tried out in the WHO trial called Solidarity, is the use of hydroxychloroquine as the 4th arm. So all these different treatment antiviral specific treatment modalities are being considered at this point of time. A few new things on the block: plasma therapy, wherein the use of convalescent serum from patients who have had the disease or who have positive IgM antibodies have been tried, and is being tried. There is right now a trial being designed in the United States where they are looking to use plasma therapy as one of the treatment modalities. As you might have seen the news as recently as yesterday, Sri Chitra is looking at going down the trial. Some of the other centers also are looking to use the plasma therapy as a modality and need to try it out on a randomized trial. So these are all different kinds of therapies which are being tried. Right now there is no one therapy which can be told to be useful. There is even no data to say that any of these therapies actually change the course of the illness or shorten or help in curing the COVID-19 disease. There was a lot of talk about use of chemoprophylaxis in the high-risk population in the recent past, and as you all know, I think because of the guideline put out by the ICMR, which said that people who are taking care of or healthcare workers who are taking care of COVID-19 patients or asymptomatic household contacts of a lab confirmed case can use hydroxychloroquine as a chemoprophylaxis once a week, scheduled for 7 weeks, and it may decrease the risk of developing the disease. But following that, I think that it was, to my personal opinion, I think it was a bit of an overreaction, which we saw, and people started holding hydroxychloroquine, and because if you look at the warning which the Drug Controller General of India has put out as a part of the protocol which was recommended by the National Task Force, was that this has to be used with a lot of caution, and it is not that it should be taken with a false sense of security and dump all other infection control measures. So the benefit of it is doubtful, both in terms of treatment and as a chemoprophylaxis. It can be used in patients, in individuals who are at high risk of developing the disease, or are likely to be taking care or are likely to be exposed to patients with the disease. And it can be used as a chemoprophylaxis, but the risks of taking hydroxychloroquine need to be noted as well. So I think whenever this is being prescribed, the pros and cons of this needs to be discussed with the healthcare provider or with the person who is going to be using this chemoprophylaxis. Right, now moving on to the next section of how to protect ourselves. Or a more definitive way of protecting ourselves is the use of personal protective equipment. There are a variety of guidelines which have come out in different parts of the world, starting from the WHO to the CDC guideline to the ICMR guideline, and each one has come up with different levels of personal protective equipment. But in common, all of them by principle agree the need for an eye protective device, either in a form of a goggle or a visor or an eye shield. All of them in common agree for the need for a mask. It varies from a surgical mask to the presence of a more expensive and a more definitive protected N95 mask. All of them agree on the need for a gown or a personal protective hazmat suit or overall, which will cover the neck and below chest, abdomen up to the thigh, or which has a full sleeve, long sleeved disposable gowns, in other words, and all of them do agree for the need for a shoe cover. So these are the different personal protective equipment, or the full personal protective equipment that we talk about. The ICMR, I will largely concentrate on the ICMR guideline at this point of time. So the ICMR recommends a non-wetted cap which is disposable, which prevents secretions from entering through the cap into the hair. It recommends use of an eye shield or an eye goggle or a visor mask. It recommends the use of a N95 mask which is NIOSH certified, or European standard certified, which is the FFP2 certification, or the Australian standard certification, which is P2 certification. So it has to be having, the N95 needs to be having the certification of any of these regulatory authorities. You need to have preferably a hazmat suit, or at least a long overall disposable gown, which is blue in color, disposable, which is non-wetted, and can actually, which has a long sleeve as well. So the sleeve should be long enough to come up to cover up to the wrist, so that the rest of the hand will then be covered by a single or a double layered glove. If a hazmat suit is worn, then the shoes or the footwear will be covered completely by the hazmat suit. But if you are wearing a long disposable OT gown, then it is appropriate to wear another shoe cover which is again disposable and non-bacterial, prevents secretions from dropping or penetrating through the shoe cover into the footwear. So, the standard for the OT overall for the disposable gown is what is called as the AMI 3 or the AMI 4 standard. So anything below that, like the wearing of a cloth sterilized OT green gown, is inadequate or not sufficient when we are talking about taking care of a COVID-19 patient. So this photograph shows you the full protection PPE which I was mentioning, which is recommended by the ICMR if the patient is being for the healthcare worker who is likely to take care of the patient or who is likely to be exposed to any of the aerosolized generating procedure. In fact, the ICMR even goes up to say recommend this gown or this kind of PPE protection to the doctors who are likely to take care of this patient, to the healthcare workers who are even going to clean the biomedical waste, and the housekeeping staff who are going to take care of the patient. If you look at the CDC guideline, it has been downgraded a little bit. Of course, whether it is based on the current scenario that we see in the United States, or is it based on good strong recommendations, is a matter of debate. But as of today, the ICMR recommends this full PPE protection for all the healthcare workers who are directly or are involved in the patient care or are likely to come in close contact with the patient. This slide shows you the donning process. There are different guidelines based on, this is a CDC guideline. You could use this guideline or you could use a variety of other guidelines which have come out. The guideline will be based on which region you are from. It will be based on what kind of hazmat suit or PPE you are likely to wear, whether the zipping is in the front, the tying is in the back. So different kinds of personal protective equipments or personal protective gowns have different types of donning sequence, and it's very important to master the donning sequence before you actually end up taking care of the patient. This is the doffing sequence recommended by the CDC. Again, this is one standard method, but as I said, it will again depend on the region you are coming from. It will depend on the type of PPE equipment that is available. Other infection control protocols need to be followed as well. Just like any other patient in the hospital, universal precautions need to be taken care of. What we call as standard universal precautions need to be adhered to. Additionally, for a patient with COVID-19, or if you are a healthcare provider taking care of a patient with COVID-19, two additional precautions are full contact precautions and airborne droplet precautions. I have already discussed how an airborne infection spreads both as a droplet infection and as a droplet nuclei. So to prevent that, the certain standard precaution that we need to take is ensure that the triple layer surgical mask is worn by the patient, because this will decrease the risk of him spraying the droplet into the atmosphere. Direct the patient to an isolation area. Now, as the patient suspected patient enters your ER, you need to make sure that he is given a triple layer surgical mask. The patient is immediately directed to an isolation area which is already ER marked. Preferably, it should be one with a negative pressure suction area or a negative pressure room. The patient should be at least 2 meters away from other patients to decrease the risk of droplet infection to the other adjoining patients. Cough etiquettes need to be followed by the patient, and the person taking care of the healthcare worker who is going to be taking care of the patient in terms of assessing, evaluating and going to take the swab needs to be wearing the full PPE, as I have already discussed in the previous few slides. Once the patient's initial assessment is done in the emergency and he is going to be transferred either to a ward or to the ICU, there are certain basic precautions that need to be taken. It is preferable to have an isolated separate corridor and lifts earmarked for the intra-hospital transfer of the patient. In case a corridor cannot be generated or is not available because of constraints of the building, it is important to make sure that a green corridor is created and the patient is moved or is transferred from the ER to his destination ward as this green corridor is created. So during this exercise, there shouldn't be any patient or any other patient or any other individuals other than the healthcare workers who are ferrying the patient in the vicinity of this corridor. The healthcare workers who are involved in the transport should be provided full PPE and terminal cleaning of the corridor, lift and the dedicated trolley to be done with 1% hypochlorite solution after the transport is done. Precautions in the ward, all the droplet and contact precautions as I have already told. Preferable to keep these patients in separate negative isolation wards. Patients with SARI can be grouped together or cohorted together, preferably in a negative pressure area or a negative pressure ward. It is very important to ensure that the suspects and the proven patients are kept separately. It is alright to cohort the COVID positive patients in case there are bed constraints in a given ward once we know that they are COVID positive. But if they are only suspects, it is important to ensure that each of these suspect patients are quarantined in separate negative pressure areas or in separate isolation bed areas with complete barrier precautions existing between these patients and preferably with a 1:1 nurse until the report is available. If the report is negative, then the suspect patients need to be immediately transferred to the general area, or if it turns out to be positive, then they can be sent to the specific ward earmarked to take care of the COVID-19 patients. It is very important to ensure that you have different wards available to cater to different acuity of care, or patients who are presenting with different severity of illnesses. So it is ideal to have a separate ICU zone, a separate HDU zone and a separate normal ward area to be created as we are preparing for the pandemic moving forward. And all these areas are manned by healthcare workers who are trained in the use of PPE, doffing and in the full droplet and contact isolation precaution steps. Engineering issues, special procedure rooms need to be available in these areas, especially when we are talking about doing aerosolized generating procedures like intubation, bronchoscopy, etc. If possible, it may be appropriate to defer the procedure if it is an elective procedure till clinical cure is achieved. The negative pressure rooms or wards need to have 12 to 15 air exchange cycles, at least these number of cycles in 1 hour. If it is due to resource constraints or space constraints, negative pressure rooms cannot be created. Natural ventilation rooms are appropriate, but it is important to ensure that the ventilation in these rooms through the natural window or a ventilation happens to the tune of about 160 liters per second per patient, which means they should have wide, large, open windows and with adequate amount of wind moving or air moving in and out of these in the rates which I have already mentioned. Terminal cleaning and disinfection of these rooms with 1% hypochlorite followed by the routine terminal cleaning procedures need to be done once the patient is discharged or transferred out of these wards. What about surgeries in a patient with proven or suspected COVID-19? Ideal to defer elective surgeries, but the balance of the risk of deferring the surgery versus the risk of exposing the healthcare worker to the COVID-19 infection needs to be taken into account. It is ideal to be having dedicated OT space for taking care of these, for operating patients who are suspected or proven to be having COVID-19 disease, preferably by a dedicated healthcare worker team as well. So which means the surgical anesthetic team, nursing, scrub nurse, it may be appropriate to have a dedicated team to be taking care of this OT by rotation. If possible, convert the OT into a negative pressure OT with HEPA filters, because this will give the most optimal protection to the healthcare workers in decreasing the risk of transmission of the infection, and most importantly to ensure that there is optimal barrier droplet infection precautions taken to the for this patient for the care of this patient. Pre-operative evaluation is preferably done in the ward, which means that once the patient is already in a COVID positive area or in a suspected ward, it is the anesthetic teams and the pre-operative evaluating teams go to the ward, evaluate the patient and transfer the patient directly to the OT earmarked for this patient. The surgery or the procedure is completed. The post-operative care, including extubation of the patient and such other things, will be preferably done in the OT itself, and the patient is then transferred back to the ward. So when possible, it is optimal to alter the surgical or the anesthetic techniques. Use of regional anesthesia is one way of doing it. Use of TIVA or total intravenous anesthesia further minimizes the risk of aerosol spray. Post-operative monitoring and extubation should be done in the OT itself, and when stable, the patient gets transferred to the ward directly. There is no interim ward where the patient should be transferred to either in the pre-operative period or in the post-operative period, and by this we are actually minimizing the risk of exposure of this patient to the different clinical areas, as well as to the a number of healthcare workers who are getting involved in the care of this patient. Disinfection of OT post-surgery is important. Different protocols are put up by different institutions. It is appropriate to have a local protocol by the institution which is likely to take care of these patients. There are also guidelines put out by the Government of India. The gist of it is that all the OT, the furniture, equipment, all these need to be disinfected and decontaminated with the use of 1% hypochlorite solution with a contact time of about 30 minutes. And wherever possible, it would be appropriate to use disposable consumables or disposable equipments. It is also important to take care of the biomedical waste as per the protocols which I will be discussing in the next few slides. Biomedical waste management guidelines have also been put out by the Central Pollution Control Board in discussion with the Ministry of Health. The basic principles remain the same of segregation of the biomedical waste remain the same, as in the same color-coded bags need to be used. But the important thing is that the personnel handling these need to use full personal protective equipment, starting from the cap, eye shield, N95 mask, gown, shoe cover and gloves as well. As a precaution, double cover or double bags should be used and should be labeled as COVID-19 or COVID-19 suspected biomedical waste. They would be stashed away separately in an area isolated or dedicated for this for COVID-19 biomedical waste in the hospital biomedical waste bay, and it needs to be separately picked up by the designated authorities who are going to handle the biomedical waste as well. It is also important to ensure that a dedicated staff and a dedicated trolley is used for transferring these biomedical waste generated by the handling of a COVID-19 positive or a suspected patient. At the end of all of these, the trolley and the area where the biomedical waste is stored needs to be disinfected with the help of 1% hypochlorite solution. Moving on to discharge criteria, in a patient who is positive for COVID-19 proven by RT-PCR of the nasopharyngeal swab, the following criteria are used for discharge. There should be resolution of fever without the use of fever medications for at least 3 days. there should be improvement in the respiratory symptoms for at least 3 days, and a negative COVID test or a negative nasopharyngeal swab for at least 2 consecutive swabs which are taken 24 hours apart. This following this, the patient can be discharged and called and can be described as disease free. Now, in a patient who is suspected to be having a COVID infection but turns out to have a negative test, but the index of suspicion is very high, the discharge or to call the patient disease free, the following criteria needs to be met. One, at least there should be 1 negative nasopharyngeal swab. 2, the patient should be symptom free for at least 3 days following resolution of the upper respiratory symptoms, and it should be at least 7 days from the time of the start of the symptoms or the start of the fever. A final decision in these patients who are having strong suspicion to be having the disease but turn out to be COVID-19 test negative needs to be taken on a case-to-case basis, and the index of suspicion and the risk of infection. In the unfortunate event where a patient succumbs to the illness, handling of the dead body after the COVID-19 infection needs to have certain principles followed. The first and foremost, it is important to understand that the risk of transmitting the disease to the healthcare worker by mere handling the dead body is extremely low. The maximum risk is by actually handling the lungs or the upper respiratory parts of the patient, especially during autopsy when the lungs are being handled. Having said so, it is very important to ensure that full PPEs are donned by the healthcare worker to reduce the risk of developing the infection to the healthcare worker following handling of the body of a patient who was known to have COVID-19 disease. In all possibilities, it is ideal to avoid autopsies. All recommendations across the world recommend that autopsies should never be done in these patients because the risk, especially when we are dealing with the lungs, is extremely high. Avoid embalming and such other procedures so that to minimize the handling of the patient's body, and cremation would be the preferred way to dispose the body rather than burial, and preferably if you are talking about cremation using the electrical or the gas crematorium. Burial or any other forms of disposing of the body is not recommended because of the high risk of contamination of the area as well as the risk of transmitting the disease to people who come in contact with the body as well. Terminal cleaning of the bed area, mortuary, trolley and the corridors with 1% hypochlorite solution with a contact time of 30 minutes needs to be done at the end of the disposition of the body.